In my experience with dietetics, my wife is an RD. I employ lots of registered dietitians. And my experience is that the training that they go through is very different than the, the language that you and I are speaking about nutrition now. Was that true for you back then? Did it make sense to you what they were teaching, or were you so new to the whole space that you didn't know the difference at the time?
There were two things going on. It's an excellent question, Doug. The first one is, what do you do in an ICU room? That's a whole different ballgame. Here's my prerogative: keep them alive. Keep them alive. So I'm squirting all kinds of good things in them through a central line, and I'm trying to make certain they stay alive while they're healing in the ICU, perioperatively, or whatever's going on. Then when I got to Davis to do the Pew Foundation postdoc, it became, well, these people, who are coming in are metabolically off. Okay, they're maybe overweight, type 2 diabetes, I could go on. Now what do you do? It's not, and now I have to keep them alive at a very different level. It's like, I want you to be here, 30 years from now. And how are we going to do that? And it was a different algorithm in many respects. And so for me, it was a real awakening. I had a lot to learn because, people don't realize nutrition is hardcore biochemistry. You got to know what you're doing here. You can't just sort of, read Prevention magazine and then pick it up from. No, you got to know what you're doing, especially if you're a physician who is doing the recommendations and back and forth. So my learning curve was straight up to the ceiling. And that's where I got that awakening.
Yeah. And so then how did that change? Did that change you in the critical care setting? Or did your career shift at that point into another type of practitioner?
It's very interesting. While I was at Davis, uh, something also hit me. My ears and eyes are always open. And that is that I found that stress, elevated levels of stress hormone cortisol were highly associated, with sickness and metabolic sickness. And I fell in love with cortisol. And lo and behold, at the National Institutes of Health, I was invited to become a senior research fellow with one of the top stress researchers in the world, George Crusos. And so I bagged the whole critical care thing because I didn't need that anymore. I now was becoming much more academic and I was fascinated and I wanted to do some of my own research in this. And what better place than the NIH? So I was deeply honored. And so I went 3,000 miles away to come to the NIH and to join George's lab, where we helped put together the stress fat connection. And this was when the metabolic syndrome wasn't called that yet. It was called Syndrome X.
Yeah. I
And
remember those
then
days.
yeah, remember? And then it moved over to metabolic syndrome when they realized, ruh-roh, it's like heart disease, diabetes, cancer, the whole schmear, was associated with metabolic syndrome. My fascination was fat, intra-abdominal fat, visceral fat. What's up with that? Why is that, when it becomes too excessive, so lethal? And so we were studying a model, Cushing syndrome, which is it's a somewhat rare syndrome with a benign tumor that occurs in your pituitary gland or on your adrenal glands and sometimes other places too. What's the bottom line? It just keeps squirting out stress hormone.
Cortisol.
And
Yeah.
oh man, but here's the funny thing. In the world of endocrinology, which is where I was living at the time at the NIH, we knew that people who have endocrinopathies, problems with endocrine issues, look funny. We always knew that they just look funny. There's something that was going to go on. So these people with too much stress hormone developed what? Huge amount of belly fat. And meanwhile, their arms and legs are little skinny things, so they look like pumpkins. And I went into the operating room with the neurosurgeons, and I grabbed some of that fat and I studied it in my laboratory. And that's when we began to put together the pieces of the puzzle that when you have high levels of stress hormone, there's no question that it increases the development of visceral fat. So there's your stress fat connection.
Well, and I want to pause on that for just a second because I think most people still misunderstand true visceral fat from what is sub-Q fat around the abdomen. And I'm using technical terms, so let's make it more simple, right? So when you look at somebody that has a quote unquote beer belly, there's kind of two ways that this could happen, right? So you can have a lot of what's called subcutaneous fat, meaning it's outside of the layer of the muscle versus what's inside the layer of the muscle that's actually wrapped around your organs. So give me more about the difference between these two types of fat.
Well, the subcutaneous fat, this is your pinch and inch fat. So grab your hands and, just come on down to your belly and grab it. Now, it used to be pinch an inch. It's more like pinch a mile now, but, there you have it. And if you want to really see what this is all about, lay on your back next to a mirror and then look over at the mirror. What you're going to see is that if you have mostly subcutaneous fat, and that is fat that is cushioning underneath the skin. It's just cushioning and it lays on top of your abdominal muscle, your rectus abdominis, right? So if you lay down and most of what you have is just this pinch and inch stuff, then it'll all kind of blip to the side and you'll actually flatten out and it'll look, okay, well, that's not so bad. Um, if you have a significant amount of visceral fat, when you lay down on your back and look over at the mirror, it didn't go anywhere. It's like you swallowed a bowling ball. And that's where you run into problem because visceral fat is very important for us in appropriate amounts. So it lays below the abdominal muscle, the rectus abdominis. So in surgery, it actually looks different. It looks like beige fat, whereas subcutaneous fat is yellow. So when you cut yourself accidentally and it's kind of deep, look, you'll see, in addition to the blood, you'll see
That
yellow.
that is deep. Yes.
Yeah, I mean you're kind of getting there, right? If you accidentally hit cut yourself, but the stuff deep inside looks more beige, and it actually looks like an abdominal apron, is what it's been called, and it's really important. I mean, fat is an endocrine organ and it does some very important things for us. It's just that it's too much of a good thing. That's when you run into problems. And that's when you bump up what we call inflammation throughout the body. And inflammation is the foundation of disease, whether it's, diabetes, cancer, heart disease, whatever.
So if the visceral fat is, let's call it connected to cortisol, I think it's, and the medical system is interesting and research. And I've seen a lot of things researched the way that you thought about it in the laboratory, which is you find an extreme example, right? So Cushing's disease, really high levels of cortisol for an extended period of time, and it results in this phenotype, this look, right? Um, how can we then relate that though to people who don't have that disease, right? Because like you said, it's rare. But many of us struggle, if not all of us, struggle with a lot of stress. But is that enough? Like, is the daily stress of like me and my three kids and my businesses and my patients, like, is that stress enough to start laying down more visceral fat?
Excellent question. So, this is the whole reason why I did that research. You always have to have some kind of medical model. So, we use the Cushing's people because they were easy. They're coming in with, a tsunami of cortisol on board. And whenever you study anything, you want something a little more extreme to kind of drive home the point. Well, here's the gig. As soon as my research started coming out and I started publishing, oh my gosh. So USA Today shows up at the front door and they go, wait, what is stress fat connection? And what's that about? Because they never knew any of this was going on. And I said, there is absolutely no question that when you have elevated levels of cortisol in your body on a chronic basis, I'm saying chronic. So if I went behind you right now, Doug, and I went boo, kind of like freaked you out for a moment. There you go. All right. Well, what are you going to do? Your cortisol level's going to go up for a minute because you got a little momentary fight and flight, like what's going on? And then as soon as you realize, haha, it's just Pam, then it calms down. That's what fight and flight was meant for. And it's meant to be able to keep you at a heightened level of alertness. You look at any elite athlete and you can see what they do. They're just like all fight and flight. They're like, come on down. If it's a windy day at Wimbledon or whatever the issue is, they're on it. Okay. But what happens is when people go through life, and this is where I really emphasize what goes on in a woman's life, because I like to be very gender specific in this case, because there hasn't been enough research in women. And so, like I just stand on my little soapbox here, and I always try to twist it around and nuance it to gender specific. So here's a woman who's holding down two jobs, is maybe a solo mom, and she's getting, a paucity of sleep. And then we're going to throw in the fact that she's also perimenopausal, which means sleep is all but a past dream. Um, and she's got a troublesome teenager or kid or whatever the issue may be. Her boss is an idiot, and she's putting up with toxicity right and left, right? So would you say that she has stress? The answer is yes. The question is, how is she responding to it? If she's responding to it with helplessness, hopelessness, and defeat, keep that in mind. Helplessness, hopelessness, and defeat. Then what happens is her cortisol level stays up. And then here's what happens. And Doug, this is so cool, and I want to make sure people understand this. You burn out. And so normally the what happens with cortisol is it should be high in the morning. It's waking you up with its best friend, norepinephrine. So that's your little adrenaline thing. So you got adrenaline hanging out with cortisol, both, associated with one another throughout the entire day. So it's up. You wake up, you're like, hey, let me attack the day. And then it starts coming down until right about 5 o'clock ish. Okay. And then it starts to want to level out because you're supposed to, I use heavy emphasis on you're supposed to be kind of winding things down. Because naturally that's what a cave woman would do. She'd be winding things down. It's like, okay, I've done the hunting and foraging, I'm done for the day. I got my little nuts with me for the morning. We're good. Okay. But that's not what happens. What happens is, we take on our second life. We're taking care of the family and we just got home and we dragged ourselves through the front door and all the rest of it. So you never really see that beautiful, what we call a sinusoidal curve. It doesn't happen. It looks like a kind of backwards S. And instead, it's up and down all the time. And when it does that, it interferes with everything metabolically. Everything. And then you do that long enough, we have actually measured what happens to those curves. And by the way you do the measurements is you take multiple blood samples throughout the day. Only in research do you do this. And what we were able to find was literally that sinusoidal curve became flat, completely flat. It was like nothing could get you going, not even a front end loader. And that's what happens. You never want that to happen, but it happens in so many people every day as they kind of struggle through the day. And women feel this especially.